Welcome to Analyst Talk with Jason Elder. It's like coffee with an analyst, but there's no actual coffee. Each episode, we interviewed an expert in the field of law enforcement analysis to share their career-defining stories and to get their insights on the world. Please join us on recognizing and learning from these brilliant minds as we define the law enforcement analysis profession one episode at a time.
Thank you for joining me. I hope many aspects of your life are progressing. My name is Jason Elder, and today our guest has 12 years of law enforcement analysis experience, 2 years as an FBI research analyst with the Behavior Analyst Unit, and 10 years as a research sociologist with the NCIS, not the television show. She earned her PhD in psychology from the University of Illinois. She now spends her days on global security intelligence and investigations. Please welcome Dr. Leigh Ann Perry. Leigh Ann, how are we doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I am doing well. Thank you for joining me. Let's just get started here. How did you discover the law enforcement analysis profession?
So I actually discovered this when I was an undergrad. I was at Fordham University as a business major and just happened to see a flyer on campus that the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit was doing a presentation at the campus that day. And when I attended, they talked about an internship program that they had that focused on behavioral analysis and psychology as it related to the FBI. And I was very intrigued by it. I spoke with the presenters after the fact, and they said that it wasn't something for freshman students. You could apply your junior or senior year. The next semester, I switched my major to psychology and sociology with criminal justice concentration, and applied the first semester that I was able in my junior year, and was fortunate enough to get the internship with the BAU. And that was kind of my first taste of the intel world in law enforcement.
So then what kinds of tasks were you doing with the internship?
Sure. So I was still an undergrad. I was a senior at the time. Mm-hmm. And so I was doing tasks like assisting special agents and the PhD on staff at the time, who was their research coordinator, with specific research projects that they had. So I specifically was on a project on child abduction homicide, as well as a project that looked at serial murder. And so I was helping with data collection. So basically going through case files, contacting local and state police departments to get any information that was missing from the case files, and then working through the data analysis phase of those projects. It was very, very interesting to be able to see that side of research. Going through those case files, it's things that you wouldn't normally have access to in academia. And so it gave me a different perspective on what types of work I could do in the field. And so as an intern then, I believe I was like about 20 years old at the time, I was able to get that kind of exposure to the types of research that you could do in the field after graduation.
Interesting. So what was the selection process like for this internship? Was it pretty competitive?
It was pretty competitive. We ended up in my group, I think there were 5 of us that were accepted. We came from all over the country. The internship was down in Quantico, Virginia. Yeah, it was a competitive process. We had a round of interviews. Later, when I went back to the VAU to write my dissertation and to work for them after grad school, I ended up being involved on the other side of the process with interviewing applicants for the internship. So it kind of all came around full circle.
All right. And if anybody's looking for an internship with the FBI, do you have any advice for them?
Yeah, I say go for it. You never know until you try. I would say to check their website. I know with COVID, things had been on pause. I'm not sure if they're back up and running yet, but I know their website does post that when it is available. It was one of the best things I've ever done in my entire life, was have that internship. So I can't say enough good things about it and about the people who work there. And I think it's an incredible level of experience you can get. It's offered to undergrads and graduate students, at least at the time I was there, it was. I think at either stage of your academic career, it can be very, very useful. And it's a great way to learn about the profession and find out if it's something you really enjoy or if it's something that might not be exactly right for you. And I think I tell some of the students that I mentor that is just as important, is to find out what doesn't work for you and what's not the best fit. And I've seen some people leave that internship program with that realization, but I think that's just as important too. So anyone who's out there looking for an internship and is interested in behavioral analysis at the FBI, I would say go for it, give it a shot. It's a very valuable experience either way.
And I agree with that. If you find out what you don't want to do, you can check that off the list.
Exactly.
So then this leads to a position with the FBI in the behavior analysis unit.
It does. There was a PhD psychologist there when I was interning. She said, if you end up going for your PhD, get back in touch with us because you may be able to write your dissertation with us. And so I started looking at PhD programs. And once I was in the process of, I think I was 2 or 3 years in, she contacted me again and said, we may have some positions that are opening up soon. Would you be interested in coming back? And so I worked with her and with my advisor at the University of Illinois to craft how I could make that into my internship. It's not the traditional way that a clinical psychology doctoral student would have her internship. Normally you would go to an APA accredited facility to do like therapy and clinical work, but we were able to make it work out. So I landed back at the BAU and wrote my dissertation there while working for them. So kind of did both at the same time.
So was that a requirement that you had to be a PhD student in order to get that position?
No, there were, I believe, 2 other analysts there when I joined, and they were master's level students. Or not students, master's level graduates. Sorry.
So do you have to get a clearance at this time, or did you already have the clearance?
I had to get a clearance for my undergrad internship there. So I had that. And then when I came back in 2007, it needed to be renewed. So I didn't have to do the full process again. If I remember correctly, it was an update. So they still needed to interview everyone again. I had to go through the polygraph again, but it was a bit shorter process than when I was an undergrad going for the internship.
Okay. So at this time, when you're joining this unit and you got the clearance and you got the okay from your professor, did you have an idea of what direction you wanted to go in terms of your career and in terms of your research project?
I did for the University of Illinois for the PhD program and telling them that I wasn't their traditional applicant. At the time, I didn't think I wanted to be a professor. I wanted to do research with the FBI. That's what I told them in my essay, in my application. And when I told them in my first round of interviews, I remember it very vividly. And that's what I wanted to do. As soon as I had the internship at BAU, as an undergrad, I knew that I wanted to land back there. I loved that kind of work. I liked the idea of research for an operational purpose. And I thought that was a really great place to do that. And so that was really when I realized what I wanted to do. And at the time, I was doing a lot of research on sexual violence and domestic violence. And so that was the path that I was taking through grad school. I worked with an advisor who did quite a bit of work on sexual harassment and sexual assault. So that ended up being kind of the pathway I was taking. And then when I got back to the BAU to do the dissertation, I was fortunate enough to become involved in some other projects that were different crime types. So I got to expand my kind of knowledge base there.
Okay. And you had mentioned research for operational purpose. Just for our audience here, and even for me, I guess, for that matter, what exactly do you mean by that?
Sure. So that's a great question. So I enjoy doing research that is immediately going to be applicable in like a workplace setting. And so, for example, at the BAU, we were doing research that the goal of it was not necessarily publication. The goal of it was to be able to train other agents, other local and state law enforcement officers on best practices, on different behavioral patterns for offenders, different victimology patterns, things like that, so that they could then implement it into their day-to-day work. And so while I think research is valuable, even when it's not, immediately applicable in an operational sense, I personally enjoyed being able to do research that I could then bring immediately to the field and say, look what we found. Here's how you can apply it. Here's how it's relevant to your work.
I think it's an interesting concept. I recently had Julie Rohrtell on the show a couple weeks back, and she deals with a lot of problem-solving, problem-oriented policing. We had talked about this pushback that she gets a lot, that a lot of police departments push back a little bit on some of the problem-oriented policing approaches. They're long-term. Sometimes some of them are dealing with outside the police department, so there might be a control issue there, and it's expanding the comfort zone, if you will. Did you experience the same thing where you're bringing research into law enforcement? And I was kind of curious if you dealt with locals versus the FBI, and if there was a difference there.
Sure, that's a great question. So Short answer, yes, there was pushback, but not by everyone. And so the FBI, with the BAU, it was a bit different because they had part of their mission statement at the BAU was research. So there really was not the pushback you would expect there because everyone was used to that as a component of their work already. But with that being said, that didn't mean that other law enforcement agencies that we worked with didn't push back on findings that came out of the research, how we did the research, but also how long things take. So I also worked with NCIS for the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, and I did research for them as well. And I worked with different law enforcement departments there as well. And so some of the pushback that comes, and I understand where they're coming from, is about how long research can take. Mm-hmm. And so research projects can take up to a couple of years, sometimes longer, but I would say an average of a year or two to be able to gather the data that you need to, analyze the data properly, and then report out your findings. And that's not even taking into account the very front end where you're formulating your actual research question and your hypotheses and designing your study. So it does take time. And I know a lot of the people that I worked with were great coworkers that just would get frustrated with the amount of time it took. I could completely understand it. And so I can see why there is some pushback that, the answers are needed now. So research isn't the way to go, but I would argue that it is. It's part of the way to go, right? Like there's a whole bunch of tools you can use and research is one of them. It just requires a little bit of patience. Benefit I see with research is that while it does take a bit of time, the results that you get from it can benefit a department or an agency for a very long time after that. And not only the results that you get, but the results that can build off of what you get. So your research project could spur an additional project down the road that could help a department or a company. And that may not have been possible if you didn't do that initial baseline research first. And so I think it's a matter of really just trying to work with each other across different disciplines within a police department or within an agency to explain why it is you're doing the research, why it is that it takes so long, and why that's important, right? For reasons of like validity, reliability, all these terms researchers like to throw around. It is important for those reasons, or else the results are kind of useless. And so you just need to figure out a way to convey that. And that's what I used to work at doing, both at the BAU and NCIS, was to pitch why research was relevant and why it's important and how it's useful. And then once you can convey that, I think then the roadblocks tend to come down.
In terms of the results, did you just have one document that you would hand out that would go to both researchers and maybe law enforcement? I'm just thinking here, research expects a certain way the paper's going to look. And maybe law enforcement thinks like, oh, geez, that's a 70-page paper or whatever you're handing me there. And so did you have different documents for the different audiences?
Yes, definitely. No, that's next. I'm laughing because I did give a paper that had been published in a journal to one of my coworkers once, and I'm laughing because of his facial expression. He was just like, I don't know how to read this. And so you have to know your audience, right? So we'd create documents differently based on who our audience was. And so with the exception of one paper that we put out for publication, I don't think I ever wrote a research paper while I was at the FBI in the same way I would write it had I been still in graduate school. I always wrote it, abbreviated versions of it, so that it could be easily consumed. So a couple of pages, or even sometimes using like a graphic image to better convey the information. So yeah, it's all about audience. And even the same research project could yield multiple different products that could either be distributed for training purposes or, just internally to the office. So it really depended on who asked for the information and who the intended audience was. But yeah, we would never hand a 70-page APA formatted research paper to the agent down the hall. That would not go over well.
Yeah. So can you give some examples of the research that you were doing at this time with the BAU? And maybe what the issue was, what the research found, and then what the recommendation was?
Sure. So I was in a unique position where I was hopping across different BAU units. They have multiple units within the BAU that cover things like crimes against adults, crimes against children, terrorism, threat assessment, cyber, things like that. At the time, there were only 3. There are more now. But I was fortunate enough to be able to work across all of them at one point or another while I was there. And so I did some research on targeted violence in institutes of higher education. So basically like mass shootings at colleges. I did that for a bit. and worked with the Secret Service and Department of Education on that product, which it was made available, I want to say it was probably about 8 or 9 years ago now. They finished it up a couple of years after I left for NCIS.
What was the conclusion to that? Do you remember?
It wasn't necessarily one conclusion. It was basically looking at an aggregate of the data across all of those different incidents. And we went back, I want to say, to the 40s or 50s. Don't quote me on that. I'd have to look back at the exact parameters there. But it basically looked at what were the percentages of times that X weapon was used or X location was used and things like that, to break down what were the commonalities across the incidents, what were you most likely to see, different correlations. So there wasn't like any types of causation found, excuse me. It was more correlates, but it was basically to give an overview of what we were seeing across the landscape there. This was back in 2000. I was there at 2007 to 2009. So this was a while ago, but that was the type of thing we were looking for there. It was published to the public so that it could be used the schools could use it directly, as well as police departments. That's why the Department of Education was involved as well.
Okay. So the idea there is for schools to use some of these indicators that you developed in the research to then look at their facilities to see if they have maybe similar weaknesses in security.
Yeah, that's definitely one way. We had an agent who worked on that project. He was the lead on it. His name's Andre Simmons. He's very recently retired from the BAU, but he used to work with universities across the country on setting up threat assessment programs and finding those gaps. And so he was phenomenal to work with, and he was excellent on this report. And so, yeah, that was definitely one of the things that could come out of it, was schools being able to use it in that way.
So as you mentioned, you were there with the FBI for 2 years, and then you move on to NCIS, and that's Naval Criminal Investigative Services, in case
Correct.
Folks don't know. I assumed folks knew that, and I probably shouldn't assume. But why did you make that transition, and how did that impact your PhD?
Sure. Good question. So when I was at the FBI, I was there as what was called an ORISE fellow. ORISE stands for Oak Ridge Institute of Science and Education. So it was a program that brought in recent graduate students. I wasn't there as a full-time FBI employee. So I worked for the FBI, but through this fellowship program. And so actually Agent Andre Simmons, who I just mentioned earlier, had come back from a conference one day and said to me that he had heard about NCIS needing a researcher, like a head researcher, and it would have been a federal employee position. So I would have been a full-time federal government employee there. And so he was like, I talked to some of the people and it seems like something that would fit. And he's like, they're literally right down the road. So they were in Quantico as well. So I figured, let me put in an application and see. I was still writing my dissertation at the time, but it wouldn't have affected anything. I could still work with the BAU on that while at NCIS. I double checked. And I was fortunate enough to get offered the position to, at the time, be the only researcher there to head up their research program, and later was fortunate enough to be able to hire on one of the interns that I had. We were a very large 2-man research program at NCIS when I ended up leaving.
Okay, so then since you're creating this program there, as you look back now, what were some of the initial challenges and lessons learned?
Oh, good question. I had a lot of lessons learned. One big challenge that I found, well, first was there was only one of me for a while. So that was hard because I was hired on to start up a research program, but with one person, you're pretty limited, right, in bandwidth. And I was also supporting on other types of analysis. So things like we had a crime report, like an annual crime report that we would put out internally just to track numbers of cases across different crime types. And so I was in charge of that as well, which took quite a bit of my time. Another big challenge that I had was research projects, as I discussed earlier, take quite a bit of time. And when there's only one of you, even when my coworker Blair Robertson ended up coming on, there were only 2 of us. So the projects that normally would take a year were taking 2 years because we had 2 of us instead of a 4 or 5 person team, things like that. And so one of the difficulties and challenges was that people wanted the products sooner. They wanted the results and findings way sooner than we could get them. And again, I understood. I could empathize with that. I wanted the findings sooner too. But it was just something we struggled with, trying to balance our other duties and those long-term research projects with the amount of people that we had. And so those were some of the biggest challenges. Lessons learned would be that I think on the front end, I probably should have figured out a way to be better at explaining the research process. and what it entailed and what would be needed to be able to have that move along a bit more quickly. And I think I probably didn't do as great a job as I could have at the front end explaining that. I tried to do it more. The longer I was there and realized it was an issue, I tried to do that, but I probably should have done that way early on, and I didn't.
Okay. Because whereas you mentioned with the FBI, it was part of their protocol to have research, and NCIS, they were just trying to get this established. So there's a bigger learning curve there for them as you're coming on board.
Right. And for me, because it was a different setup than the way the BAU had set up their program already. So I had a lot of learning to do as well when I got there. And they had a couple of researchers before me, but from what I understood, they had only lasted for a month or two each. And so nothing had really gotten any headway. And so I was really the first one who was there for any extended period of time. And so, yeah, it was a big learning curve for all of us. And so my coworker, Blair, who I mentioned earlier, is still there fighting the good fight and working hard on research there. So I'm hopeful that that program can really take off if they're able to get some more people in there.
So then is the research similar to what you were doing with the FBI? Did you have similar types of research and then similar types of results?
It was a bit different. So the main thing was with NCIS, our focus shifted over to any crimes that affected the Navy or the Marines. So that was one main difference. But we were also looking at different types of crimes. So the FBI BAU, they see not that any crime is not bad, but they see the very extreme crimes. So like serial murder, child abduction, homicides, things like that. My focus content-wise shifted a bit when I got to NCIS. I did a lot of work around child-related crimes, child abuse, child sexual abuse, child pornography kind of cases. And so I shifted in terms of content focus a bit. And that's just the nature of it, right? It's just a different agency. They have a different focus. They also focus on other types of crimes, but that was the one when I first came in that they wanted me to start looking at. Also adult sexual assaults. As things were coming up in the country, there was a lot of congressional push when I was first coming in for work around sexual assault in the military. And so Blair and I did quite a bit around that as well. And so those projects were extremely close hold. They all stayed internal, so I can't talk about results of those.
Okay.
But I can say that what we did was we were focused on how these crimes impacted the Navy and Marines, whether it be service members, but also their dependents. So whether it be children or spouses. And so that was the main focus. We wanted to do things that were going to better the people involved with the Navy and the Marines. So that's how we approached each project.
So were these crimes that you were studying, are these just that happen on the military base, or did these go beyond the military base into the civilian world?
Sure. So they had to have a military nexus. So what that means, they could have either occurred on a Navy or Marine base. They could have had a subject and or a victim who were either Marine or Navy members or their dependents. So they had to have one of those to be considered the nexus. So it didn't necessarily have to happen on a base. It could have happened on off base. But if it involved, for example, a Marine, then it would fall to us. If it was a civilian who committed a crime on a naval base, that would fall to us as well.
The law, then, maybe the definition of some of these crimes can differ, right? So you mentioned like sexual assault on the base versus sexual assault maybe in a particular state that base is in may differ.
Right. So sexual assault's a tricky one because that definition varies across states, as well as then also for the military, they fall under the UCMJ, which would then have its own definition as well. So that was an issue we actually faced with the Bureau too, because when it came to sexual assault cases, because that definition was so different depending on the jurisdiction. So that's a very good point. That was definitely something we were keeping in mind.
And you said USMJ?
UCMJ.
What is that?
Uniform Code of Military Justice.
Well, let's take a break. When we come back, I want to get into your analyst badge story. I want to talk about you as a professor teaching a serial murder class. And I just wanted to get your advice to our audience.
Sounds good.
You're listening to Analyst Talk with Jason Elder. We'll be right back.
Hi, this is Scott Eicher, and I am a retired FBI agent. And I just wanted to point out that FBI agents are people too.
Hi, this is Shelagh Dorn. Do you want to build your credibility with field personnel, with police officers on the street? Get a candy dish, put it on your desk, and fill it with good candy. That's your opportunity to talk with people and engage. You can send out a million emails. People might know your name, but they don't really know you until you talk to them face to face. And that candy dish is an opportunity to talk with people and really get to know them.
Hello, this is Brian Gray, and my advice for analysts is don't settle for mediocrity. If you want to be happy in this career, long term, you can't be a minimalist. Just don't do what you're asked for. Do what you know is right. And don't ever substitute quantity for quality. And if you haven't found a way to put design to work for you, you're not doing your best work.
Welcome back. Leigh Ann, I want to get into your Analyst badge story. And for those that may be new to the show, the Analyst badge story is the career-defining case or project that the law enforcement analyst works on. For you, we've kind of been building it up throughout this whole interview thus far, and that gets into your dissertation. So let's just do an overview for our audience, what your goal was, what the topic was, and any particulars that you want to share with us.
Sure. So the topic for my dissertation, the title of it was Re-examining Typologies of Sexually Violent Offenders. And so I looked at a very large sample. It was over 4,400 subjects using FBI data because, again, as a reminder, at the time I was working there, so I had access to that. I wanted to look to see if, using the data to guide me, if typologies emerged based specifically on crime scene behaviors. There's typologies out there for sexual assault, and they all have different types of value to them. They're all great. But I wanted to use one that didn't look necessarily at the motivation of an offender or the psychological makeup of an offender, because you wouldn't necessarily know that if you had an unknown subject, right? So I thought, because I enjoy the operational side of research, what could I do to help law enforcement at the beginning stages of an investigation? And so I thought, well, if I look at what they can see, which is the crime scene behaviors, what's present at the crime scene, even if the subject's unknown, let me see if that would give me something, if that'll show me that there's these kind of clusters of behavior, different groupings of behaviors. And so that's what I did for the dissertation. After the dissertation was done, it ended up that 7 groups emerged. And I kind of saw this as a jumping off point for future studies. So I found these groups where there was these clusters of behavior around the level of violence used, the types of weapons used, things like that. But what my hope was that someone would see that, or that I down the road could take it and look at how that maps onto known offenders. So when you do know who your offender is and you look at what their crime scene was like, how does that map onto the typology that came out in my study? And then based on that, are there certain similarities with offenders who fall into one category or the other? For example, do they show psychopathic traits in one category while they show narcissistic traits in another? And then that way, it's a way to kind of bridge the gap and have these crime scene variables, but also the psychological makeup of an offender in the way that the other traditional typologies have looked at it. And so that was kind of where I was going with the dissertation. And then I was lucky enough that a couple of the coworkers that I had at the BAU, even though I was at NCIS by the time I defended my dissertation, there were a couple of the BAU folks that wanted to join in with me to build off further from the dissertation and write an article for publication on it. And so we ended up partnering up with a cold case investigator from NCIS named Lou Eliopoulos, who's recently retired, and then Dr. Tom Dover, who's a crime analyst at BAU, and Tim Keel, who's a major case specialist at BAU. We all got together and started working on a follow-up report to submit for publication on this so that we could, get the findings out even further to the community. In addition to working with BAU folks and Lou at NCIS, we also worked with 2 professors, one who was my advisor at U of I, Dr. Nicole Allen. She's a professor of psychology there. And also Dr. Stephen Lancaster, who's an associate professor of psychology at Bethel University. And so we had an academic perspective. We had the FBI BAU perspective. We had cold case perspective from Lou over at NCIS. And it was a project that I will never forget. I thoroughly enjoyed it because I am someone who loves having multiple perspectives in a room. I think it yields the richest products, and being able to sit around a table with these folks and kind of hash out different ideas and different ways of viewing this, different ways of presenting it to an audience, to me was really, really exciting. And I was extremely happy with what ended up coming from it. Yeah, I thought it was a great way to bring together different law enforcement agencies as well as academia to show that those different realms could play nice in the sandbox. Because I think sometimes people assume academia and law enforcement don't mix. And we were able to show here that it is possible to do.
Can you quickly list the 7 groups and give a definition?
Sure. So we found 7 different groups. We considered them classes. So the 7 class names were, first was sadistic, which I think is probably pretty self-explanatory. The second was low violence impulsive. And so what we meant there with the impulsive part was that the approach tended to be a blitz approach, as opposed to like a ruse or a con, like a thought out type of approach. The third was high violence multiple approach. So this one, the approaches were kind of all over the map, but the level of violence was significantly higher than in group 2. The fourth was the sadistic sexual group. So it was differentiated by the first group in that the trauma locations on the victims were primarily of a sexual nature. Whereas in the first group, which was the sadistic group, the trauma locations were present all over the victim's body. It was not just focused on the sexual portions of the body. The fifth class was the high violence planful. And by planful there, we mean that there was a thought out approach to the victim. So you would more often see a con approach by the victim or a ruse where it was something that was thought out ahead of time. The sixth group was the low violence planful. So similar to the group I just mentioned in that there were con approaches, but the violence level was significantly lower. So less physical trauma to the body than in that previous group. And then the final one was low violence, socially insecure. And so the difference here with the socially insecure was that the approach tended to be a surprise. So not that planned out con that we were talking about in the previous 2 groups. This one tended to be something where we would assume the offender may not have had the social skills to be able to pull off a ruse or a con. And so we labeled that with the socially insecure.
So is these all a matter of the suspect and the victim don't really know each other?
Many of them, I would venture a guess that most of them are. The thing is that we don't know for sure because a lot of the offenders in the sample that I used were unknown. They were never captured. So we don't know for sure. And some of the victims were killed after the sexual assault. So we didn't have information from the victim in those cases, obviously, to be able to ask who the offender was. And so that one I can't answer. The one thing I will mention, though, with those types that I just listed off, there were main areas that we were focusing on for the different crime scene behaviors that we were measuring. And so we focused primarily on trauma locations to the body. So where was the trauma focused? The approach of the offender to the victim. And we didn't know that in all cases, but we were able to ascertain it in most. Any unusual assault or trauma, so think like, for example, cigarette burns on the victim's body, things like that, something that would be out of the norm. And then any sexual activity that occurred. So what type was it? So was it foreign object insertion? Was there no foreign object insertion? That gives us an idea into the offender's mind as well. That tends to go more toward the sadistic side of things, depending on how that sexual activity plays out. And then we also looked at the use of potentially deadly force. So as I said earlier, some of the victims were killed in this process, but we didn't want to measure that particular variable based on just whether the victim lived or died. Because in some of the instances, in those cases, the victims they received a level of force from the subject where they could have died, but maybe they had access to medical care more quickly than another victim. And so they were able to survive. And because we were more focused on the offender behavior as opposed to the outcome, to us, it made more sense to look at, was there the potential for deadly force based on what the offender did, as opposed to what was the outcome of what the offender did.
In terms of the victims then, and these classifications, do you see differences in when you factor in the victim's age or race?
We didn't factor that in actually for this. We wanted to just base it specifically off of what was seen in terms of the offender behavior at the crime scene. So we didn't go into the race or the age of the victim.
And then, so you mentioned the different perspectives that you were able to capture with this project.
Mhm.
And I'm just curious to know, in terms of maybe one of the classifications, was there a vast difference between perspective the researchers take from the classification versus the practitioners take?
That's a really good question. Let me just say one thing. I'm sorry about your previous question I just thought
Sure.
of. While we didn't break down ages specifically, we did only deal with adult victims. So I should say that these
Oh,
were
okay.
only 18 and older.
Okay.
So I should have mentioned that for the victims. So child victim crimes to us were kind of a whole different element. So we didn't want to conflate those. So these were only adults that we dealt with. Back to your other question, your question currently. So we didn't have, a ton of disagreement. What we tended to have the most discussion around was how to name these classes. That was, I vividly remember that taking several meetings because we wanted to come up with a way that made sense to law enforcement, but also to researchers, and also something that properly captured the different variables that we were looking at. So like the trauma locations approach, et cetera. And so I do remember several conversations around that before we finally came to a conclusion. But with this group, what was interesting was that while there wasn't much disagreement, it was more on the front end while we were trying to prep how we would present the paper, which sections we were going to write about, because as you probably know, a dissertation is significantly longer than what you can fit into a journal article.
Mhm.
So we really needed to figure out what we were going to focus on and how we were going to do that. That's where most of the conversation came in. And that was interesting because Dr. Allen and Dr. Lancaster, being academics, had published a lot. And so they had some really interesting perspectives that the rest of us hadn't, those of us that were predominantly in law enforcement research. And so we were able to learn from them what worked best for that publication setup, and they were able to get from us what would make more sense for the law enforcement community. And so that was a nice back and forth that we had with that to make sure that both sets of readers would get something from the report.
So in terms of the law enforcement side, then, is this developing a profile?
I wouldn't say it's developing a profile because we don't have the subject's characteristics in here yet. This was just looking at the crime scenes.
Mhm.
It could be used to inform research into profiles down the road. So as I stated earlier, I wanted this to be kind of a jumping off point or a baseline study for someone to then take and be able to compare which offenders fell into each of these 7 groups and see if there was some type of similarity in those offenders. I think if we were able to get to that point, if I were ever, I would love to be able to do this again too at some point in my career, to jump back in and take a look at this again. And if we ever were able to do that, then that would be, I think, where it would start to be on the profile or behavioral analysis end. And that's what, when I had spoken with previous colleagues at the BAU, that's how we were conceptualizing this, that this would be the starting point, but that there would be, room for this to grow, to be used in what they would call criminal investigative analysis, aka profiling within the BAU. And so this is kind of the starting point for that, but it is not at the place where you would be able to use it yet because we don't have the specific offender characteristics in.
So have you received any feedback from law enforcement based on the article, maybe how they took it from their angle, or was there anything put into practice because of your journal entry?
I haven't. I've spoken with the BAU folks about it, obviously, because they were involved too. But I know that they have used it in some of the research and things that they're doing around this, and in preparing for some of the trainings that they do, because that's one of their other mandates in addition to research, is doing trainings. But I haven't had anyone reach out to me from other police departments or state agencies.
Was there anything else that you wanted to add about your dissertation?
Not that I can think of. The main thing really is that the second portion of the dissertation, where we put it into publication form, was really a team effort. And I consider myself very lucky to have been able to work with that incredible group of people. I wish that more people in the field would be willing to do those kind of collaborative efforts, because even if it gets frustrating or takes longer because there's more players involved, it really is such a good experience to be able to get all of that different perspective and experience in one room to learn from each other. And so I consider myself very lucky to have been able to do it.
Let's move on now then. As I mentioned before, you teach a class called Exploring Serial Murder at Salve Regina University in Rhode Island.
Yes.
And so I guess, how did that class came to be, and what's the goal of the class?
Sure. So I started teaching for Salve Regina University last year in their summer session, and I was teaching a course called Law and Human Behavior. I had met the head of the Graduate Studies Department through a colleague at NCIS, and we had spoken a few times, and he contacted me in May of last year and said, hey, our professor for Law and Human Behavior had to step away this summer. Would you be able to take the course? And so I was like, sure. I like teaching. This sounds great. So I taught that class. And while I was teaching it, I thought, there could be some room in this curriculum for a class on specifics of serial murder. So something, a specific crime type as opposed to a more general forensic psych approach. And the name of the department is the Administration of Justice. So I figured it would fit nicely under that. And so I pitched the idea I put a very rough syllabus together, pitched the idea to the head of the Graduate Studies Department and the head of the Administration of Justice Department, and they liked it. And so I said I would put a full syllabus together and prep a course and see what they thought. And they ended up coming to me a few months later and asking if I would teach it in the spring semester of 2021. So I'm currently teaching it now. I've really enjoyed it. I have a great group of students. It's a graduate class. And it's a small group. I have 14 students, so we can really be engaged with each other in the class. It's taught online, which works for me because I don't live in Newport where Salve Regina University is. And so I teach it online and thoroughly enjoying it. We actually wrap up the semester the end of next week. And then I'll launch back into the summer class for Law and Human Behavior. But yeah, it's an interesting class. I put it together to try to look at different aspects of serial murder. So we look at different theories. We look at psychological theories, sociological theories, biological theories. We look at different types of offenders. So team offenders, female offenders, male offenders, and then also at investigations processes and profiling. And so I tried to put a lot of things into the one class to give a nice overview to the students. And so, yeah, that's where that class stands now. I'm hoping I'll be able to teach it again in the future. I really enjoyed it.
All right. So I'm just kind of curious, what was the students' expectations coming into the class?
That's a good question. So I'm not sure. I think they probably found the title of the course to be intriguing. I did have some students who are law enforcement officers, and I have others who are full-time grad students. So it's a mix, which I really enjoy at this school. Actually, it makes for really interesting course discussions too. And so some of the students that I always ask the first week of class, like in an online discussion board, if they want to introduce themselves and say what their reason was for taking the class, if they want to. Some said that they were interested in this because they were hoping to go into the criminal justice or law enforcement field. Those were some of the graduate students, the full-time graduate students. Some of them, like I said, were police officers who said they just wanted to learn more about this specific crime type to be able to use in their career. And so there was kind of that variety there. And I let them know right at the beginning that this was the first time I was teaching it, so that I encouraged them to give me feedback along the way. And so I'm hoping, we have a feedback survey that just went out this past week. So I'm hoping to have some more insight into what they thought worked and didn't work and tweak that if I'm able to teach it again. But yeah, I think that the goals were different for each student, depending on whether they were, 20 years into their career or a brand new police officer or, in their second year of their master's program. It all varied.
I think it's interesting. I don't necessarily have that appetite for serial killing and documentaries and TV shows, but there's so many of them. I think I must be on the minority there, because I'll have friends just going on and on and on about it. So I know there's a big interest in that topic.
There is. There's documentaries all over the place about it. It was part of the reason why I wanted to do the course, was because I wanted to break down what people see on TV and show like what's really happening, right? So you have the documentaries, but you also have like the crime dramas. So like Criminal Minds, for example, which is based on the BAU. There's serial killers on that one all the time. I know it's ended now, but it was a very long running series. And
yes.
And I personally love the show. So this is not a knock on the show. I loved it. But, you don't, in a half hour or 1 hour long show or documentary, you don't really get to dive into the theories behind serial murder, or how do the investigations actually happen when they don't need to have the crime solved in the 30-minute time frame, right? So that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to take the allure of the TV version of this and show, what what's the real story behind this? What actually happens? And get the students to think very critically about it. I'm very big in my classes about critical thinking. I don't like when we just regurgitate what we read, right? So I ask them to think very critically and about some of these different theories and what do they agree with, what don't they agree with, what makes sense to them based on what they've seen in these documentaries and TV shows, what is something that they weren't expecting to hear about. And so that kind of formed the basis of our discussions throughout the class.
Do you feel it is easier or more difficult or about the same for one to establish themselves as a serial murderer today versus maybe 30 plus years ago?
What do you mean by establish themselves? To actually commit the murders or to get away with it?
Yeah, because there has to be a sense there of you have to get away with it for so long before you're really established as a serial killer.
Oh, that's fair. Good question. So there are more tools now, I think, to help investigators. And I'll plug one of them now because I used to work with them. It's called VICAP, the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program. So that's part of FBI's National Center for the Analysis of Violent Crime with BAU. And so I worked with VICAP quite a bit. And what VICAP does is it helps local law enforcement, state law enforcement to link cases across jurisdictions. So different police departments across the country and some in other countries will enter cases into VICAP. It's all online now. They can all enter it in, and you can search for different standout factors in a case. So, for example, if in your jurisdiction you've had a murder where someone was tied up and put in a certain position and left sitting up against a wall, you could enter those factors of the case into VICAP to see if there's another that pops up in another jurisdiction that you may not have known about, right? To see if there may be a link that can show you have a serial offender. And so those kind of tools, VICAP's existed for a little while now, but it's become more readily used and readily available, over the last decade or so, I'd say maybe 15 years. And so those kind of tools that could catch serial killers would not have been available to a law enforcement officer 30 or 40 years ago. And so that might make it more difficult for offenders. However, I still think people are people and they're still going to have that propensity to kill if that's what their psychological and sociological factors bring them to. And so even with law enforcement, unfortunately, I don't think we will ever get away from offenders at least attempting to have serial offenses. I just think that we're getting better at the tools to potentially detect them. And so hopefully we're catching them at a higher rate. There's just really no way to know that, unfortunately.
Let's get into some of your advice. Usually ask our guests to either think about advice either to a student or a brand new analyst. And I also asked to think about an experienced analyst. What advice would you have for them?
Sure. So I actually have the same advice for both. And it's always be willing to accept feedback. I think that sometimes feedback can feel like an attack on us when we get it, like we're doing something wrong. Mm-hmm. And I think it's really important to try to reframe that. And I struggle with it too. Like, your feelings get hurt sometimes. Somebody gives you negative feedback on something, but I try to make a concerted effort to realize that there's no way to really grow and get better at what you're doing than to take what feedback you get from others and learn from it. You don't have to necessarily agree with it, but at least think through what they're saying and what they're offering to you and really critically think through that and learn from that in one way or another. As I've seen people get further in their career, it becomes harder, I think, to accept feedback because you start to think and get in a mindset where you're more of an expert than other people because you've been doing this a certain amount of years. And I think even if you're an expert, there's always room to learn and things to learn. My advice to seasoned analysts would be always be willing to accept feedback and continue to learn from other people. And I would say the same thing to the undergrad students that I mentor, because I would want that to be something you kind of establish early on for yourself so that it's easy for you to do later in your career.
If someone is looking to follow in a similar path as you, getting into research that is more operational in purpose and into studying psychology or something similar, what advice would you have for them that maybe something that would be a good return on their investment they study now to get the most out of like 5 years from now?
That's a good question. So for a strict research role, I would suggest looking into professors and researchers who you who you have interest in their work. So if there's a particular area of research that you're interested in, do a little bit of homework and see who's doing research in that field now, and see where they teach, if they teach, where they teach. And then at that point, you can reach out to them and see if they are supervising students. Maybe you can apply to that program. But if they're not, do they have recommendations on people that are doing similar work in the field that do teach and supervise students? Because I think when you're looking for grad programs, especially in this kind of field, I think it's really important who your advisor is and who you work with, because that's the type of research and lab work you'll be doing. And so I think it's not always necessarily just the school itself, it's the professors within the program and the researchers within the program that you'll be going to. So that's something that I didn't know about when I was younger. It hadn't really occurred to me, but I learned it along the way. And I like to tell my mentees that now too, is don't always just think broadly about the school, think also about who's in the program that you would want to work with. Because especially for research purposes, that could guide, the direction that your research career ends up going.
Very good. Well, our last segment to the show is Words to the World. And this is where I give the guest the last word. Leigh Ann, what are your words to the world?
So law enforcement analyst work, whether it's intel or research or crime analysts, it can be super demanding and sometimes really draining because of the heavy topics that we cover, and especially with everything going on in the world today. And so as a way of bolstering resistance and well-being, I would ask everyone to consider exploring different ways of incorporating different levels of mindfulness into your routine, whether it be physical activity, meditation, cooking with your family, spending time in nature, anything that helps you to center yourself. Mindfulness can just be a really great way to help reduce stress. It can increase your focus and your productivity, and it can also increase your patience and compassion to others, but also to yourself. And so I would just really encourage everyone to kind of take a step back every now and then and implement that in whatever way works for you to help to build up resilience, around these very challenging topics that we work with.
Very good. Well, I leave every guest with you've given me just enough to talk bad about you later. But
Great.
But I do appreciate you being on the show, Leigh Ann. Thank you so much, and you be safe.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Be safe as well.
Thank you for joining us today on Analyst Talk with Jason Alder. We hope you not only enjoyed the show, but also learned something new. For more information on our guests and information relating to today's topic, please visit our website at leapodcast.com. Special thanks to the Rough and Tumble for our theme song. For more of their music, you can visit their website at theroughandtumble.com. Also thanks to Kyle McMullen for our show logo. For more of his design, please visit his website at moderntype.com. The show is hosted, recorded, and edited by Jason Elder and written by me, Mindy. You can contact us both via the LEA Podcast website. Please join us again next time as we interview another expert in this great field.